James McIntyre.
Like this.
Yeah. Bear with us while we get technology. Bear with us while we get technology going. I've dropped off here. No, I haven't. Okay. Everyone hear me okay? All right, I'll do these myself. It's interesting that the two gentlemen I'm going to speak about are, in David's words, arrived here after Port Macquarie was past its heyday. However, they came into this colony of pilfering and cheating. What I'd like to do today is to look at two of the men who were involved in the management of the penal colony of Port Macquarie, particularly two Church of England men and their families, who were sent to Port Macquarie by the government as part of a larger study, that I'm going to be in, that I've been involved in for some time. So I'm going to speak about Dr. James McIntyre and Reverend John Cross. They're their dates of birth and death in the margins, in the brackets after them, but the dates that I'm talking about in Port Macquarie are 1827 to 1858. These dates cover the arrival in Port Macquarie of James McIntyre in 1827 until the death of Reverend John Cross in 1858. Thus 31 years of the penal colony, if we can still call it that by that period, and that's something that we need to investigate more. Most of you know that is reputedly a convict settlement from 1820 to 30, but convicts did not evaporate in 1830, and many of the men who worked there well until the 1850s. Because he arrived in Port Macquarie before the Reverend John Cross, I'll deal with James McIntyre first. This overview is probably known to many of you in the body of the audience here in the room today, but I think it's worth looking at again in terms of our new examination of Port Macquarie as a convict settlement. The convicts were not here alone and in isolation. The idea today is to look at two men, their families, and their interaction with the settlement. James McIntyre was born in the parish of Glenorchy, Ayrshire, Scotland. He arrived in Sydney on the Hugh Crawford in the first week of April 1825 with 56 other Scottish immigrants, including the McIntyre brothers John and Peter, who settled on Thomas Porter McQueen's Sedgenhoe estate in the Hunter Valley. No direct relationship has been confirmed between the Sedgenhoe McIntyres and Dr. James McIntyre in Port Macquarie, despite many years of dredging about. Potter McQueen was a politician and coloniser who employed about 160 convicts and chartered the Hugh Crawford and the Nimrod in 1825 to bring out this party of carefully selected, mostly mechanics, farmers and shepherds. The vessel also carried 122 sheep and 8 cattle among its valuable merchandise. McIntyre had received his training in Scotland by attending lectures and obtained a licentiate diploma certificate from the Faculty of Physicians and Surgeons in Glasgow. Excuse the image, but it's better than not having it at all. His medical qualifications were confirmed in New South Wales in May 1852, when the Medical Board in New South Wales acknowledged his qualifications. On the 7th of July 1825, he was appointed Assistant Surgeon in the Medical Department in New South Wales, and in February 1826 replaced Mr. Anderson as Assistant Surgeon in Sydney. In 1826, he was Assistant Surgeon in Sydney Jail and Sydney Hospital. In July 26, he was one of several medical men who freely offered their services to establish a town dispensary in Sydney to assist the poor, suffering from disease who were unable to pay for medical service. On 1 August 1827, Assistant Surgeon McIntyre was appointed to replace Assistant Surgeon Moran at the penal settlement at Port Macquarie. By November 1828, McIntyre was granted 1,000 acres of land by Governor Brisbane, and by 27 July 29, he was firmly established in Port Macquarie, where he was witness to the marriage of Henry Harding Parker to Mary Ann Cross at St Thomas's Church of England, performed by the bride's father, Reverend John Cross. 11 years later, in 1838, Anne Mary Cross became James McIntyre's sister-in-law when he married her sister, Louisa. In December 1833, Surgeon McIntyre had been assigned a convict labourer, and by the time of the 1837 colonial muster, long after the penal settlement had closed, he had 17 assigned convict servants. Full details of these convicts are available elsewhere, and I've been working on them. But it's of interest to note that all except William Johnson per planter 1832 were single, and all except 2 were Protestant, including 7 who were Irish. Only 1 was from Scotland. These convicts possessed a wide range of useful skills. Most could read and write, and there were 3 school teachers. But since McIntyre's first child was not born until 1840, the teachers were not immediately useful to him and his family at that time. Establishing how long they remained as part of his workforce is on the agenda as an interesting future task. Memoirs of his firstborn daughter, Louisa, indicate that Dr. McIntyre was offered a post in New Zealand, but resigned and instead accepted a grant of 500 acres on the Wilson River, about 25 miles from Port Macquarie. At that time, the family lived in Coolfintray, an estate on the junction of the Wilson and Maria Rivers, while they cleared land and built a house and a cottage for farm labourers. This property was at Rowlands Plains, west of Port Macquarie. They had 4 domestic servants from the women's factory, as cook, laundress, housemaid and nurse. In 1846, additional labourers were hired, but the following year, after a long dry spell, followed by a destructive flood, reminiscent of things happening recently, they sold this property and in 1848 moved back into Port Macquarie, where James purchased a private medical practice, which included a full dispensary and residence originally built for Mr. Ackroyd of the Commissariat. In 1850, he purchased a property on the north shore of Port Macquarie, which remained in the family for the next 100 years. Would have been nice if it had remained in the family until 2021. I'll get to why I'm standing here in a minute. There is no surviving image of James McIntyre, but he was described as a big, kindly man and an indulgent parent. He visited his patients on a large bay horse named Doctor, and practiced in Port Macquarie until his death from heart failure in July 1853. He was buried in what is now the historical burial ground, and people like Hamish who haven't been here before must go for a trot in that. When his wife Louisa died over 30 years later, on the 6th of October 1887, she was buried in the General Cemetery, even though her husband and parents were in the historical burial ground. As noted earlier, James McIntyre married Louisa Cross, daughter of the Church of England minister, John Cross. This marriage took place at St Thomas's on the 8th of August 1838, and the marriage produced 6 children. All except Eliza, who became a missionary in Bundaberg, district of Queensland, remained in the Port Macquarie district, with their families retaining strong associations through the Parker, Noble, Wilson and Follott families. Some of those names were on David's list for the 1828 inquiry. More about those families remain a story for another time, given we've got 20 minutes. John Cross was a Church of England clergyman This hangs in the foyer, or did last time I was up there, hangs in the foyer of the church and is from the Mitchell Library, this image. According to the Australian Dictionary of Biography and his biographer J.W. Fawcett, he was probably born in London, but my subsequent research indicates he was born on the 10th of June 1781 at Bristol. Fawcett obtained most of his information by talking to John Cross's grandchildren, so some facts may be incorrect. Fawcett recorded that Cross had no brothers but had 3 sisters, one of whom reputedly became the mother of 21 children. Horrifying too, was enough. Making a rare sight as they walked to church on Sunday in a line 2 abreast. Though I wonder about Fawcett sometimes. John Cross had an excellent education and won high reputation as a Greek scholar before entering holy orders. He was an assistant tutor at a boys' school in London and was ordained a deacon at Fulham on Trinity Sunday, 17 May 1818, by Dr. Howley, Bishop of London. He received priest orders from the same prelate in the same chapel 2 months later. John Cross married Anne Davis on the 20th of July 1800 at St Anne's, Soho, Westminster. The ceremony performed by Curate Joseph Jefferson and John Satchell and Sarah Cross, a possible sister of the groom, as witnesses. Little is known of Anne Davis other than she was born in Wales about 1780. And because she died on 10 May 1836 here in Port Macquarie before civil registration, we know little from that source. The burial record only noting she was buried on the 12th of May, aged 56, came free and was the wife of Reverend John Cross. The couple, with 3 children, Anne, William and Louisa, arrived as free passengers to Sydney via Madeira and Hobart on the convict ship Bearing on the 14th of June 1819. The Bearing also carried several missionaries of the Church Missionary Society, including Reverend John Butler and his wife, son and daughter, James Kemp and his wife, Francis Hall and Thomas Toory and Eatery, New Zealanders who had sailed to England on the Kangaroo in 1817. Cross's naval issue Bible is survived and is in the Historical Museum here. It's an item of national significance. He continued to use it throughout his ministry in New South Wales. When Cross arrived in Sydney, there were only 4 Church of England clergymen to administer 18,000 people, 7,000 of whom were convicts. The other clergymen were Samuel Marsden at Parramatta, William Cowper at St Philip's in Sydney, Robert Cartwright on the Hawkesbury, and Henry Fulton on Norfolk Island. Initially, Cross conducted services at Parramatta for Samuel Marsden, who had left the colony for missionary service in New Zealand, not long after the arrival of the other missionaries on the Bearing. When Marsden returned in late 1819, Cross replaced Robert Cartwright as chaplain at the Hawkesbury district and was incumbent during the final and respect of all classes of resident both in the town and neighbourhood. Presumably, that reference came with him to Port Macquarie. On the 4th of December 1827, Cross was appointed rector and chaplain to St Thomas's here in Port Macquarie, succeeding Thomas Hassell, who was Reverend Samuel Marsden's son-in-law. The Cross family sailed to Port Macquarie on the Lucy Ann, which, as many of you know, came up and down from Sydney to Port Macquarie on many occasions. They arrived on the 18th of February 1828, but when they reached their destination, they discovered they were unable to cross the bar and had to take a small boat to reach the settlement. It being only 7 years old at the time, and Cross spent the rest of his life here again, having again to complete a church. Soon after their arrival, the new church was opened, and Cross supplied the church with communion vessels, a bell and other requirements. Hassel had held early services in the open air, and the foundation stone for St Thomas's on 8 December 1824 had laid that on 8 December 1824, but it was still incomplete when Cross arrived. Convicts worked day and night to complete the church, and as Meg Keneally said, we've talked a little bit about the mortar in the bricks there already today. And the first service was held just 6 days after the new minister's arrival. He remained the only permanent clergyman for the next 16 years. The church is a massive brick structure with a Norman tower, capable of holding 600 people, say the history. His congregation was mostly conscripted, being convict. The services were accompanied on the violin and flute, and one of Tamsin's convicts has already been mentioned as adding voice to that choir. The chaplain also visited the jail, and his granddaughter, Mrs. Henry Harding Parker, nee Louisa Isabel Cross, recounted her memoirs that it was his practice to drop pieces of tobacco for the prisoners, contrary to regulations. You can see there the pews and the surrounds in the church are quite high. When I stand in them, they're kind of a bit lower than chest height, which made it very difficult for modern people to get in and out of those pews. I'll get more to that in a minute. These are the 7 children of the connection between the McIntyre and Cross family. And you can see there the names that we've already seen on lists. Parker, the 2 Parker brothers there, both married Cross women. Cathcart Wilson, her father was very much involved in the penal colony of Port Macquarie. And there's also Ellen Pender Follott, whose ancestry goes way back into Devon, and John Henderson Noble. I could speak for a long time about those people, and many of you in Port Macquarie will know them. This dip into 2 families who served the community between 1827 and 1858 opens a lot of historical questions, which needs much more examination. What I've done here today in the short time available is to give a little bit of biographical background to these men who now need much more in-depth looking. And I know several people have looked at them, but I don't believe to the depth where how are they responding to the convict population, who is employed by them, what are their relationships on the ground here in Port Macquarie. Who were the convicts and free who worked for them and their extended families in Port Macquarie Township and the rural districts surrounding the settlement? What happened when free settlers began to arrive and emancipists took up land? And indeed, I also need to interrogate that 1828 inquiry a lot more. And certainly and importantly, what was the local impact on the Indigenous population? What survives in written documents and what survives in local Aboriginal traditions with respect to the interaction of these 2 men and others who ran the colony? These issues and questions are a fascinating part of the development of this area, which began as a place of secondary punishment, but soon became a rich agricultural community and is now very much a place where respectable people retire. And my personal connection, how did I get interested in this? Well, my name might give it a little bit away. That's my father-in-law, Stuart Pender McIntyre, who is my husband's father, obviously, who was actually born in North Queensland, but came back here with his father, and they bought property on between Willawarren and Bellbrook on Nulla Nulla Creek, west of Kempsey. and he lived there his most of his adult life, farming cattle, and was on the Kempsey Shire Council for over 40 years. So I thought I'd pay homage to him here today by having a photograph of him in his mayoral robes. So that's my personal collection, and I debated whether I would actually show you, and I will. So my father-in-law, Stuart Pender McIntyre, was one of two children, the only son of John Pender McIntyre, who was born in Port Macquarie in January 1891, the eldest of four children of John Cross McIntyre. Stuart, who you see here, was born in Townsville and moved to the local district, as I've said. And finally, a personal note. Time is a terrible thing. Here I am with my husband, John McIntyre, in St Thomas's, Port Macquarie, in January 1878. Oh, 1978. But you know, that happens. I often write the year I'm born as 18 because I live in that century. Absolutely. I always say nothing happened in the 20th century except that we were born. So thank you very much. It's very much a dip into a much, much bigger study that until this kind of seminar and discussion with Hamish and Tamsin and David about how we can interrogate the records and working with Port Macquarie Historical Society and Genealogical Society, and those of you who live here and are excited by the history of this place. Those of us who work as historians could never actually delve to the depths that we want to now. It would remain an overview like the biography I've just read to you, which is just a start for where we're going with this stuff. So thank you. I'd like to get rid of that. My lovely husband's twice the man he was in that picture.
But you're not. Just trim the secretary. Does anyone have any questions?
Not a question, but a lot of people who were living as being born in Port Macquarie, they came from upriver, they came from Kempsey, they came from Taree, and they were registered as Port Macquarie.
Actually, that's correct, because it's the district, the registration district, and that's something those of us who do minutiae.
Right until late 1890s with a lot of them. My family were almost that.
Yeah.
They were upriver and had to road.
So it's something to be really aware of. But it's the registration district. I mean, even the birth, deaths and marriage indexes might say, I don't know, Inverell, and it could be in the middle, it will be somewhere.
I'd like to make a comment if nobody else. Both those papers made me think about how I consider the officers and the authority figures. And in my determination to focus on convicts, I sometimes feel that that's an area that I underplay. And so I've decided I'm going to add a chapter to my PhD focusing on the officers. Because the same shenanigans go on at Newcastle and Morecambe Bay as well. They're all falling out.
I'm absolutely certain that the Reverend John Cross, despite his job, would have also been involved in all sorts of little underhanded things, because they all were.
Yes.
It was part of the culture at that period.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much, Harry.
Registrations are worse out west because you have to go for days to register a birth. So
Hamish.
they say they were registered in Hay. If births were registered, for example, in Hay, they may not have come from Hay. It was dependent on where the registration office was in Hay. They had to go across the Hay Plain to register the birth, the death, the marriage, the whatever. So it only happened when they went there. Hence the reason for the discrepancy in the occurrence and the registration. You might end up with 2 or 3 months afterwards. So you need to be aware of those kind of things as well.
Thank you so much. That was a perfect comment, because what Diane's doing is demonstrating that expertise that you as family historians have